So greetings from Pennsylvania once again, and we are in the state capital area of Harrisburg. We're just a little bit south of there in an area called Paxton. We're actually at the old Paxton Church and Cemetery. Was it the oldest continuously operating Presbyterian church in Pennsylvania? Second oldest in the country. And the previous video I filmed here, I walked around, we looked at the church, the old reproduction log church, and the cemetery down there. Lots of Revolutionary War veterans, French and Indian War veterans down there. Beautiful place. But today's video is about the Paxton Boys. That's why we're starting our video here at the old Paxton Church. And this place ties in with the story of the Paxton Boys. It's not a pleasant story. It's a kind of a dark splotch on Pennsylvania history, American history, but it happened. So we're going to talk about it. And I've been doing a series on the French and Indian War, and this is from that time period. Roughly just a few years after, because you had the French and Indian War from roughly 1754, 1755 to the early 1760s, 1763 roughly. But then after that there was something called Pontiac's War, or Pontiac's Rebellion, which occurred in 1763 and ended sometime in 1764. So that is when, about the time area of the Paxton Boys, 1763. All right, let me just give you a quick look around, and then we'll talk a little bit what happened. And just down from me there is the beautiful old stone church, built roughly around 1740. So it was around in 1763 when the story of the Paxton Boys took place. Of course, out there is the old cemetery next to it. Tons of historic graves out there. Beautiful spot out here. I'm just kind of sitting under the shade of the trees here. So before we get into the details of this story of the Paxton Boys and the massacres that they committed, I do need to set the backdrop for you of this time period, and it will help to explain why they did what they did. It doesn't justify why they did what they did, but it explains. History isn't just about learning what happened, it's also learning why it happened. That's probably, in some ways, that's the more important thing, because if you learn why it happened, you can hopefully avoid making the same mistakes in the future. But unfortunately, we don't do that. What's that saying goes? Those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Same thing. So it's not just about knowing history, it's about knowing why it happened. So we're going to talk about this time period, what's going on, and what led to the Paxton Boys doing what they did. I mean, some of you are familiar with the story, but yeah, not the brightest time in PA history. All right, so I've got you set up on the tripod here. You might hear different noises coming from the city as I talk a little bit here, but I do need to give, like I said, the background to this story and what led to the Paxton Boys committing the massacres that they did. But of course, this dates back to the 1750s, the mid-1700s. French and Indian War starts, in 1754. We've covered that in previous videos. Started out in Western PA with George Washington, the Jumonville, Glen situation, and of course, it was a situation between the French and the British for control of the Ohio Valley area. Of course, that led to other things. Many of the local Indians sided with the French because they were upset about things. We talked about that in the video. The Penn's Creek Massacre, which occurred in October 16th of 1755. Certain tribes were upset, like the Lenape tribe were upset. They got kind of cheated out in several of the treaties. There was the Walking Purchase Treaty, which they agreed to, they agreed to sell a certain amount of land by how far a man could walk in, like 2 days or something. So they figured that wouldn't be too much, but the British sent their fastest runners who ran, day and night as far as they could, and the natives weren't expecting that, so they lost a lot of territory. And then they moved to another area, and then the Iroquois who were up for the north, sold their land. That made the Indians angry because the Iroquois didn't talk with the Lenape, they just sold their land. So they sided with the French, and that's what led to them committing those massacres on the eastern Pennsylvania frontier. We've been talking about that a lot in the videos. And in a lot of ways, this whole video is about people redirecting their anger at others. Those Lenape tribes were angry about what happened to them, so they, instead of attacking the Iroquois or other people, they attacked innocent people along the frontier and committed a number of atrocities. And it's kind of what the Paxton Boys did too, to be honest. It was redirected anger against innocent folks. I started to hear sirens going off, all kinds of stuff here in the city. All right, back when this all happened, this area was a lot different than it is today. You would be hearing all this. You can probably hear the sirens on the video. All right. Anyway, but yeah. So, but the actions of this French and Indian War ended about 1758 in this area. Looks like the sirens are coming this way. Let me turn you off. Yeah, they're right behind us now. And a plane flying overhead. All right, welcome to Harrisburg. All right, quiet it down just a little bit. That's what happens when you film in the city. Although it doesn't look a whole lot city-like here, right where the church is, but it's kind of where we are. All right, what was I saying? Yeah, 1758, most of it ended with the Treaty of Easton, which we talked about in the previous video with Conrad Weiser. But then in 1763, hostilities picked up again a little bit north. There's a couple of Native American tribes up around the Great Lakes region didn't care for the situation that happened after the French and Indian War. Some of the terms, I got bugs crawling on me, that occurred that the British imposed on them. So there's a rebellion led largely by an Ottawa chief named Pontiac. It was often called Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. And then that made those Indian attacks and massacres start up again in this area, and made the people in this area upset because they didn't feel that the Pennsylvania government was providing enough security for them. And in some ways it wasn't, because Pennsylvania was governed by the Quakers. Quakers are pacifists, don't believe in war and fighting. So when the French and Indian War broke out, Pennsylvania was not prepared. They had no standing militia or anything like that, because the Quakers are what ruled the government at that time. And even in the building of the forts along the frontier, some of which we've visited in previous videos, they were not always well fortified or stocked like they needed to be. So Pennsylvania was not really well prepared for the war, and that in some ways led to a lot of the deaths that happened during that time period. So the people had a reason to be upset, because there was quite a distinction between the Quakers living in Philadelphia down there in the city and the frontiersmen who were not Quakers, who were experienced the attacks from the Native Americans. So there was quite a distinction between the two, and it boiled over into our story. Yes, and once again down there is our church, the old Paxton Church, and this plays directly into our story, because one of the leaders of the Paxton Boys was a man named John Elder, and he was the parson, or one of the pastors of this church, and he's actually buried right down in the corner of that cemetery. You might take a look at it in a moment. I filmed it in the previous video. Yeah, he's often referred to as the fighting parson. I believe he fought in the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. So he is a veteran, but I do have some harsh criticism for him later in the video and his dealings with this. He wasn't involved in the massacres, but he was a member and a leader of the Paxton Boys, and his handling of the situation probably wasn't what it should have been. Yeah, so once again there's our church, and John Elder is buried right down in there. Who knows, any number of the other Paxton Boys could be buried in here too. And they weren't all boys. That's just what they were called. They're men, maybe some of them were boys. They're you can think of them as a vigilante group, that's what they're often called, that formed as a result. They're angry about the Indian massacres that are occurring, and rightfully so, because during the French and Indian War alone, over 200 settlers were either killed or abducted in that time period. They're facing constant attacks by the angry Indian tribes. They're losing their homes, their families, so they had a reason to be upset. Yeah, so the group was originally formed, I think, in some ways to defend the area, and in some ways to retaliate against those attacks by the Indians. And I think they even sent an expedition up the Susquehanna River to deal with some of those tribes, but I don't think they were too successful in that, for exactly what happened. But I think I remember reading about that. So they redirected their anger elsewhere. Yeah, and as I just mentioned earlier, this is a story of people redirecting their anger, not just the Paxton Boys. Mentioned, the Lenape Indians, they redirected their anger. They were angry about their situation, earlier in the war, so they redirected their anger. They were angry with what happened to them, against the colonial government and the Iroquois Indians, but they didn't attack either of those. They attacked innocents along the frontier. The women and children, unarmed people, attacked and massacred who they could. Paxton Boys did the same thing. They couldn't, they had no success in dealing with the Indians who had committed the atrocities, so they had turned their attention to Indians who hadn't. Nearby there was a group called the Conestoga Indians. Not too few of them were left, but they had been granted a section of land by William Penn in 1690 down in Lancaster County, in the area known as Conestoga. And there were 20 of them still living there. and they had nothing to do with the atrocities committed during the French and Indian War or during Pontiac's War. But unfortunately for them, they were Indians, and that's what the Paxton Boys were looking for. They were looking for some target to redirect their anger, and they turned their anger on the Conestogas. So the Paxton Boys had discovered or were tipped off that these Conestoga Indians were living down there in Lancaster, not too far from the Susquehanna River. I think they called it Conestoga Town. Like I said, these were innocents. They were not involved in the French and Indian War. But they became a target for the Paxton Boys. So there were two separate massacres. The first one occurred, they both occurred in December of 1763. I forget the exact date for the, but I have notes in the Jeep there. I'll give you the exact date. But we're going to go visit that marker in a moment here. But there were only 6 Indians home at that time in the village. The other 14 were somewhere else. There had been a snowstorm, and the others couldn't have gotten to town, to hometown where they lived right away. So there's only 6 there. But Paxton Boys, 57 of them, I think the counts read that they were all drunk, 57 drunk Irish Scotsmen left this area, went down there and just, yeah, massacred those 6 Indians, mostly older ones, parents of the other ones. Yeah, completely unarmed, just massacred them. Yeah, and that was only the first massacre. And then they discovered that there were others who were not home, and then the second massacre occurred. But we're going to go to the site of the first one. There's a marker down in Lancaster County. I think it's right at the intersection of Safe Harbor Road and what's called Indian Marker Road. So we're going to go look for that. Go look for that marker next, actually. Yeah, so December 14th is when that first massacre occurred at Conestoga Town, which we're going to head to now. So we got a little bit of a drive. We're up here in Harrisburg, so we got to head down to Lancaster County. All right, hopefully we can find this marker. Yeah, so we are now down in the Lancaster County countryside. Those of you that are familiar with the area, I took 441 down along the Susquehanna River, down this area. It was just down in the town of Washingtonboro. Now we're looking for Safe Harbor Road. That'll take us to the marker. So it would have looked a lot different back then in our time era that we're talking about. Alright, so we are on Safe Harbor Road now. Had to correct myself. Someone wrote down the wrong directions. That would be me. But it's all good now. So we're looking for Indian Marker Road. And that's where the monument will be. The fitting name, Indian Marker Road. It's up this way somewhere, hopefully. Alright, so we found the marker. It is right at the junction of Indian Marker Road and Safe Harbor Road. Not much area to pull over at, but there is a stone marker up here where this massacre occurred. Yeah, Conestoga Indian Town. The Conestoga Indians, in origin largely the survivors of the defeated ancient Susquehannas of Iroquois stock, located their village variously on these lands in the Penn proprietary manor of Conestoga, chiefly west of this point. They were visited here 1701 by William Penn. Doesn't mention the massacre though. William Penn, who made treaties with them, the tribe was exterminated by there it is, by the Paxton Boys in 1763. So in this area, there's Naomi. Yeah, they do have a marker for it there. Yeah, right, so there you have it, the marker for the massacre. Remember, only 6 of them were killed in this massacre, of the 20 that were part of this little group. The other 14 actually fled to Lancaster, the city, and they were protected there. I'm going to find another place to talk a little bit more about that. This is not exactly the safest place right here where I'm parked and whatnot, but yeah, so this is the location. Maybe not exactly right at this spot where the marker is, but in this area, probably across the fields there, was where they had their town. And they were massacred. You know, once again, these were innocents. They had nothing to do with the atrocities that were committed against the settlers during the French and Indian War by some of the other Indian tribes. Alright. But yeah, the other 14 kind of came upon the scene, and other people found out about it, and they were sent to Lancaster for protection. But unfortunately, that didn't work out for them. Of course, this occurred on, I think it was December 14th, I said. And a couple weeks later, another tragedy occurred to the others. So we'll get to that. But I think I'm gonna find another place to pull over a little bit to talk about that, I think. But we're gonna try and visit that site too in Lancaster City. Alright, so we're back on the highway now. This is Route 999. We're heading east into Lancaster City now. So I think I'll quick talk a little bit about what happened in this next part of the massacre before we get into town. I'm gonna try and find a place to park. But the massacre occurred where today at the corner of King and Duke Streets, or is it, no, King and Prince Streets, where the Fulton Theater is now located. There is actually a monument there, and part of the original building is still there from the 1763. And the building that was there back then, I think at one point was a jail. I forget what it was called back at the time in 1763, like a workhouse or something, but that is where they put the remaining 14 Conestoga Indians. They kept them there for safety, but that didn't work out so well. The Paxton Boys figured out they were there, or learned that they were there, and on December 27th, they returned to finish the job. Alright, so here we are in town, and this is the back side of the Fulton Theater. I was able to find parking right here. This is Water Street. Down there is King Street going across, and the next one over would be Prince Street. Back there, that's the original stonework of the old jail back in 1763. Yes, so on Sunday morning, December 27th, Paxton Boys rode into town. They chose Sunday morning because they knew most people would be in church that time and not be out in the streets to stop them. I think there were two people keeping guard of this place, the sheriff and somebody else. When the Paxton Boys showed up, they did step aside. Yeah, you can call them cowards, but you know, if they hadn't stepped aside, they probably would have been killed too. But yeah, the Paxton Boys, there were 14 people, those Conestoga Indians kept in here for safekeeping, but it didn't work. Paxton Boys murdered and massacred them as well. Women and children, a few old men. All right, but let's go see if we can find that plaque over there. If we can get across here. I see a couple over here, but I'm not sure which one is the one. It's just in the memory of John Durang, first native-born American actor born within the site of this building, 1768. It's not what we're looking for, but that's interesting. Oh yeah, here it is. Site of the Conestoga Indian Massacre, December 27th, 1763. So there you go. Like I said, this stonework here is original to that time. Alright, so we are out of the city now again, back out into the Lancaster countryside. I'm actually at my next location. I'm going to film another really awesome old cemetery here. But our story of the Paxton Boys is not finished yet. Yeah, and a price was put on the head of any Paxton boy that could be identified. A reward of $600, but no one turned any of them in. There was a lot of support and sympathy for them at that time, unfortunately. So none of them were actually brought to justice. And after this, after the second massacre, they marched on Philadelphia, actually. Now, in the first massacre, there were about 57 involved. I'm not sure how many were involved in the second one. But yeah, I think from different records I read, anywhere from 250, one account said like 600 of these Paxton Boys marched on Philadelphia. Why? Well, part of it, they had heard that there were other Indians that had fled to Philadelphia, and that was true. A number of Indians from other areas in southeastern Pennsylvania found out what was happening and fled to Philadelphia for safety, and that's where the Paxton Boys were headed. But they were stopped. They were not able to commit any atrocities there in Philadelphia, because there were British and colonial troops there in Philadelphia, so they couldn't do anything. It's kind of interesting how when faced with other men with weapons, all of a sudden they don't do anything, but when they're just facing unarmed people, women and children, they have no problem doing what they did. Ouch, but it's true. But yeah, they couldn't commit any crimes there in Philadelphia, but they were still there, and they were kind of a threat to the city, the people, and the Native Americans that had fled there. But Ben Franklin and some of the other notable people from Philadelphia went out to meet with them, to talk with them, and to hear their grievances. And they did make some sort of like a treaty with them. The Paxton Boys agreed to leave as long as Franklin and others brought their grievances to the Pennsylvania legislature, which they did, but nothing really ever came of that. Yeah, and after that, not much more was heard about the Paxton Boys. It kind of just faded into memory, the memory of history. Not a good memory at all, in the least, but it's something to remember. Like I said at the beginning of this video, you can remember history, you can learn about it, not just what happened, but why it happened. And on that note, you can understand why they did what they did. They were angry about the situation. We talked about that at the beginning of the video, the massacres and the inability of the Pennsylvania government to really do anything to stop it, their grievances. But it doesn't justify their actions at all, though. Yeah, like I said, it's misdirected or redirected anger against those who were actually not involved at all in what happened to the settlers. But, you know, that's what happens in life. It happens even in our own personal lives. People find ways, you know, people get angry, and instead of maybe being able to direct their anger to those who caused their situation, they redirect it to others, or it gets misdirected to those who had no part in it. And that can happen in families, the job site, at school, different places like that. It's quite a common thing. And most of us has probably been on both sides of that. Most of us has probably had misdirected anger towards others or been the subject of that kind of anger from other people. And in either case, it's really a good one. So yeah, you can learn. It's a horrible piece of Pennsylvania history, but you can learn from it in like a personal way. You know, in my own estimation, you know, the Paxton Boys, at least the ones that were involved in the massacre, you know, not all the Paxton Boys committed those massacres. You know, only, you know, a certain percentage of them are the ones that showed up at those sites. There's a train. Oh, that's probably the Strasburg, right near the Strasburg Railroad. That's probably the train. Anyway, not all the Paxton Boys were involved in the murders, but the same way to know about the murders and to stay involved in the group is wrong in and of itself. I mentioned that pastor at the beginning of the video. I think was named John Elder, you know, the fighting parson. Having learned about him, I don't really think too well of him, to be honest, because you know, he's a pastor of a church, and many of those Conestoga Indians that were, you know, massacred had become Christians themselves. They had adopted many of the customs, the habits of the settlers around them. A lot of them had turned to Christianity. So his own group, he's a Christian, he's a pastor of a church, and his own group that he helped to found murdered other Christians. You know, just think about that. I don't really know. And when asked by Ben Franklin, you know, why he was involved in the movement, his answer was a little bit wishy-washy. He didn't condone the massacres, but he didn't condemn them either, and I don't really see how you could do that. Anyway, let's see the train. You can kind of see it down there. Just one of the engines. So I'll probably go ahead and end the video here. There's probably more I could ramble on and yap about, but I probably said enough in this video. And I know I probably get accused of taking sides. I'm not taking sides in this video. I condemn the actions of the Paxton Boys, the massacres. I also condemn the actions of the Native Americans that were attacking the settlers during this time. All these, because, you know, they were attacking innocent settlers as well, women and children, you know, massacring them. It's just like one of these things goes back and forth. Neither actions are something to be proud about or good in any way. So, and there's no justification for either side. But it's history. It's what happens when one group does something, the other group tends to retaliate in the same manner, and it's ugly. That's history. That's war, and it's ugly. But we can learn from it. All right, we can learn from it. All right, I'll stop blabbing. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the Paxton Boys, you can obviously do more research yourself. I think I've said most of what there is to say, but you can always do a little bit more research yourself. All right, but I got another awesome cemetery I want to film, so I'm gonna get going to that. Anyway, thanks for coming along on this little journey, and I'll see you around, hopefully.